How long has it been since you gave your departed loved one a full hour? No phone, no clock, no one else in your head. 1 hour that belongs to him and to him alone. If he were still alive and sick, you'd give it to him without a second thought. You'd hold his hand until your back ached and you couldn't sit up straight anymore. But ever since he closed his eyes, what you've been giving him is crumbs, a passing memory, a thought you start and never finish. Split attention because your life keeps moving forward and he stays behind. On June 12th, you can give him something different. 1 complete hour done in a very precise way that Saint Teresa of Avila described 4 centuries ago. And according to her, that hour frees a soul from purgatory. Who exactly will be the one to cross over? That question has an answer, and it has a name. The name that catches in your throat when his favorite song plays on the radio, or when someone mentions him in conversation and you have to look away. Whether that name crosses over on June 12th depends on something Saint Teresa of Jesus described 4 centuries ago, and that most Catholics have never done even once in their entire lives. Before we go any further, write his name down in the comments. Just the first name, no surname, no explanation. That word is the first step of what you are going to do on June 12th before the Most Blessed Sacrament. Subscribe now and tap the bell, because what follows depends on every single minute, and you need to hear it through to the end. What's coming next? Saint Teresa wrote with someone like you in mind. Someone with a name carried in her heart, and this very date marked on the calendar. The Holy Hour is something very specific that the overwhelming majority of Catholics have never done even one single time in their whole lives. 60 straight minutes before the Blessed Sacrament exposed on the altar, with one single intention. And without getting up at the half-hour mark, without breaking it up to run an errand, without splitting it into 2 short visits of 30 minutes apiece because you were in a rush that day. Christ himself defined it in the 17th century when he appeared to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque at the Visitation Monastery of Paray-le-Monial in the French region of Burgundy. The apparitions took place between the years 1673 and 1675. The young nun was 26 years old when she received the first one. She was kneeling before the Most Blessed Sacrament exposed in the convent chapel, alone, on an ordinary visitation afternoon, when the silence broke open in a way that she herself later described as a physical awe that left her unable to move for a long while. In one of those apparitions, the Lord showed her his open heart, surrounded by flames and crowned by the cross. And he asked her in plain words to spend an hour with him on Thursday nights between 11 and midnight in memory of his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane on the eve of his death. Christ told her something that night that the saint set down in her autobiography with great effort and with real fear that her superiors would never believe her. He said that most of his own abandoned him in that decisive moment, and that a soul who agreed to keep him company during that complete hour would carry on herself graces that no other devotional act could produce in the supernatural economy of salvation. That is where the practice of the Holy Hour is formally born. But 100 years earlier in Avila, another Carmelite woman was already doing something very similar, without having received it through an extraordinary mandate or a public revelation. Saint Teresa of Jesus spent long hours before the sacrament at the Convent of the Incarnation, where she lived from 1535 onward, and afterward at the Convent of St. Joseph, her first Reformed foundation from 1562. In the chapters of the book of her life, where she describes her Eucharistic raptures and her way of staying before the Most Blessed Sacrament, it is clear that her practice of prolonged adoration came more than 100 years before the visions of Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque. What in the 17th century became a universal devotion of the Church, in the 16th century was already written down and lived by a barefoot woman in a cold stone Castilian cell. No one had told her to do it. The very phrase Holy Hour did not yet exist to name what she was already doing. And here comes the part that matters for you. What you call prayer for your departed loved ones probably bears very little resemblance to this. You say an Our Father between the kitchen and the laundry room. You whisper a Hail Mary while you wait for the car to warm up. You offer the rosary up for the one you lost, but you lose your place by the 4th decade because the phone rings. That is legitimate Catholic prayer. Of course it is. No one is going to take its value away from you. But it stands at another distance from the Blessed Sacrament than a holy hour made the way Christ asked for it. The holy hour requires 3 elements that almost never come together in the everyday life of a devout Catholic. The first is duration, 60 straight minutes, not 55, not 57. A complete hour, because the very word the Lord spoke to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque referred to 1 hour, not to a little while. The Church has honored that figure for 4 centuries. The second is the exposed presence of the Most Blessed Sacrament. This means the consecrated host is on the altar, visible to the eyes of the one who adores. The Eucharist in its sacramental form, where Christ is truly present under the appearance of bread, as the Council of Trent defined in 1551, and as the Magisterium has repeated without interruption right up to our own day. And the third is a single intention. 1 intention per hour, 1 single name. The mental list of all your departed loved ones, your sick relatives, your family troubles, and all your other petitions. You can take care of those throughout the rest of the year in your daily prayer at home. The holy hour is for 1 soul at a time. Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque received it that way from Christ. Saint Teresa of Jesus lived it that way in her oratory. And the plenary indulgence that the Church grants for a half-hour of sustained Eucharistic adoration, set down in the Manual of Indulgences in its 7th concession, is applicable to 1 soul in Purgatory, 1 single soul, the one you choose. Your departed loved one enters that equation if you decide to place him there. If you decide to write his name on a piece of paper before you leave home, carry it folded in your pocket, take it out when you kneel before the exposed sacrament, and leave it there for the entire hour as a living offering. The overwhelming majority of practicing Catholics have prayed 1,000 complete rosaries and have never made a single full holy hour in their entire lives. You might still be one of that majority right now. Or you could change that on June 12th, just a few short days from now. And here a question is left hanging, one that the Church seldom resolves from the ordinary parish pulpit, not even in parishes where the tabernacle is open every afternoon and the priest is attentive. Why June 12th in particular? Why not any other Thursday of the year, as Christ originally asked of Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque? What does that specific date on the liturgical calendar of 2026 carry that no other day shares to the same degree? Not even the other days of Corpus Christi or the Great Marian Vigils. The answer takes a little bit of history, and it requires going back to a cloistered revelation that the Church took almost 2 centuries to accept as a universal solemnity of the sacred. The year 2026, Easter Sunday, April 5th, Pentecost Sunday, May 24th, 50 days after the resurrection as apostolic tradition has held since the Book of Acts. Trinity Sunday, May 31st. The solemnity of Corpus Christi in its transferred celebration on Sunday in Spanish-speaking countries, June 7th, and the very next Friday, exactly 18 days after Pentecost, comes what the Church calls the Solemnity of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Friday, June 12th, 2026. That is the date that opens the door we were speaking of. The story of how that date entered the universal calendar of the Catholic Church is a story that took nearly 200 years to settle, and it is worth telling in full, because without understanding it, you cannot understand why this particular day carries a spiritual density that no other Friday of the year possesses. Go back to the monastery of Paray-le-Monial in Burgundy, the year 1675. Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque has just received what tradition calls the Great Apparition. The Lord has shown her in full His human and divine heart, and He has made her one specific request, that the Church institute a solemn feast in honor of that heart, fixed on the Friday following the octave of Corpus Christi. That is to say, 8 days after Corpus, on a Friday, the day of Christ's Passion, the day when the heart was pierced by the lance of the Roman soldier, according to the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 34. The saint passed that request along to her spiritual director, the Jesuit Saint Claude de la Colombière, and from there began a slow road that required the intervention of 3 popes over the course of 200 years. The first to approve the feast on a local level was Pope Clement X in 1765, nearly a century after the apparitions. He approved it only for the bishops of Poland and for the Roman Archconfraternity of the Sacred Heart. Universal extension was still a long way off. The second decisive step was taken by Pope Pius IX, who in 1856 extended the feast to the Universal Church. Any priest in the world, in any Catholic diocese, was from that point forward bound to celebrate the feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus on the exact date the French saint had received in vision nearly 200 years earlier. And the third, Pope Leo XIII, took the definitive step in 1899. He consecrated the entire human race to the Sacred Heart of Jesus by means of the encyclical Enum Sacrum. That solemn consecration, read from every altar in the world on June 11th of that year, was described by the Pope himself as the greatest act of his pontificate. That is why June 12th, 2026 carries on itself a liturgical weight unlike any other in the entire calendar. It is exactly the Friday that the Church has consecrated for more than a century and a half to contemplating the heart of Christ opened on the cross, wounded by the lance, the open fountain of blood and water from which flows, according to the most solid theology of the Magisterium, the whole of the sacramental grace that sustains the Church. And here comes something that very few people know. The Church, in its Manual of Indulgences, grants a plenary indulgence to the faithful who do 3 specific things on this day. The first, to receive Holy Communion. The second, to recite publicly, either in the vernacular or in Latin, the act of reparation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus known as the Iesu Dulcissime. And the third, the ordinary conditions for any plenary indulgence: sacramental confession within recent days, prayer for the intentions of the Roman Pontiff, and detachment from all affection for sin, even venial sin. That plenary indulgence, carried out under the conditions the Church asks, is applicable to one soul in purgatory, one single soul, freed on June 12th. If you do what the Church asks and you apply it to one specific person you carry in your heart. But there is more. And here is the doctrinal heart of this day. The Manual of Indulgences, in its 7th concession, grants a plenary indulgence to anyone who remains before the Blessed Sacrament, exposed in Eucharistic adoration for a minimum of 1/2 hour. If that act is carried out on June 12, 2026, the day consecrated by the entire Church to the heart of Christ, the concentration of grace that passes through that half hour, according to the mind of the Eucharistic mystics of Carmel, is not the same as on any other day of the year. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not use the language of the Manual of Indulgences because that manual was published after her death. But she did leave, written in the book of her life and in the way of perfection, that the hours of Eucharistic adoration lived out on the great liturgical days produced in her soul an effect on the departed that she herself described as visible and immediate, in the language proper to her time and to her mystical experience. That is why this June 12th condenses the exact convergence of a universal feast of the Church, a plenary indulgence of Eucharistic adoration applicable to the souls in purgatory, an express invitation from Christ himself to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, and a practice of extended prayer that Saint Teresa of Jesus described a century before anyone else, in words the Church still quotes today. 4 theological elements, one single liturgical date, one single afternoon in particular to do this, and one single annual opportunity with this spiritual density. And here another question is left hanging, one that will open what comes next. What exactly is it about the open heart of Christ, contemplated for 1 hour before the Blessed Sacrament exposed, that acts upon the souls in purgatory in a way that no other Catholic devotion reproduces with the same force? The answer to that question takes us to the exact place where Christ delivered his last water. Chapter 19 of the Gospel according to St. John, verses 33 and 34. Christ has died on the cross. The Roman soldiers, charged with hastening the death of those crucified because of the approaching Sabbath, come up to the 3 victims. They break the legs of the 2 thieves. They do not break Christ's because he is already dead. But one of them, called Longinus by tradition, opens the Lord's side with a lance, and from the side flow blood and water. That instant is the doctrinal center of everything that follows. The tradition of the Church has read that moment as the sacramental opening of the entire Church. The blood that flows out represents the Eucharist. The water represents baptism. And that opened side, which the liturgy has called since the 4th century, the fons vitae, the fountain of life, becomes the place where the fathers of the Church locate the origin of all the grace later dispensed to mankind through the 7 sacraments. Saint John Chrysostom, in the 4th century, wrote that from that opened side flowed together the 2 sacraments by which the Church subsists. Saint Augustine, his contemporary, used to say that the sleeping Adam was the figure of Christ asleep on the cross, and that from the side of the first man God drew out Eve, while from the side of the second man he drew out the entire Church. But there is a dimension that theology only began to contemplate much later, almost 2,000 years late. That dimension is the specific action of the open heart of Christ on the souls being purified in purgatory. And the key encyclical that fixes it doctrinally bears a name worth learning: Horietis Aquas. Translated from the Latin, it means "you shall draw water." The phrase comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 12, verse 3. And the entire encyclical was promulgated by Pope Pius XII on May 15, 1956, exactly 100 years after Pius IX had extended the Feast of the Sacred Heart to the Universal Church. In that encyclical, Pius XII establishes in a magisterial way that the human and divine heart of Christ, in its physical and symbolic being at the same time, is the fountain from which saving grace continues to flow for all the members of the mystical body, all of them, the living in this world, those in heaven, and those in purgatory as well. That last inclusion is the decisive one, because the Catechism of the Catholic Church, promulgated by John Paul II in 1992, defines in its paragraphs 1030 to 1032 purgatory as a state of final purification of the elect, where the souls who have died in the grace of God but who still need a final cleansing of the temporal consequences of their sins are purified so as to enter fully into the beatific vision. It is a state of the soul, an interior condition of purification that has no geography of its own, and that the pictorial language of the Middle Ages tried to represent without ever quite succeeding. And the souls who are there, according to Catholic doctrine since the Council of Florence in 1439, can be helped by the suffrages of the living. The conciliar words were precise. Through the prayers, almsgiving, and other acts of piety customary in the Church, and most especially through the acceptable sacrifice of the altar. The sacrifice of the altar is the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the body of Christ, which is at the same time the open heart of the cross. That is why every time the Church elevates the consecrated host, what is made present is that same heart wounded by the Roman lance, offered to the Father for the salvation of the world. Now apply all of this to June 12. That Friday, the entire Church, from the rural parishes of the Philippines to the cathedrals of Argentina, raises its eyes in solemn adoration to the Eucharistic heart of Christ. Masses are multiplied. Expositions of the Blessed Sacrament run longer than on any other ordinary Friday of the year. The hymns Adoro te devote, Sacred Heart in whom I hope, and Holy Heart of Jesus ring out in thousands of churches for hours on end. For a soul in purgatory, that universal liturgical concentration does not pass by unnoticed. St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, in one of the apparitions documented in her autobiography, received from Christ a promise that she set down with great care. The Lord told her, according to her own transcription, "To those who practice this devotion and spread it, I will give the graces necessary in their state, peace in their families, comfort in their sorrows, and they will be a secure refuge during life and especially in the hour of death." These are what we call the 12 promises of the Sacred Heart. But there is a 13th, less well known, recorded by her director, Saint Claude de la Colombière, in his later notes. The heart of Christ, opened in a holy hour, reaches souls that the ordinary Mass does not reach with the same depth. That is the keystone. Saint Teresa of Jesus, 120 years earlier, already sensed something along the same lines. In the interior castle, the seventh dwelling, chapter 4, she describes the soul united to the Eucharistic Christ and says that this union pours out its effects on the departed for whom one prays by one singular name. The word she uses in 16th century Castilian is outpouring. The soul united to Christ pours out what it has received upon the soul that needs to be freed. And Christ, she says, does not hold back that grace when it is asked of him in his own sacramental presence. That is why what is going to happen on June 12, 2026, depends entirely on something you do not yet quite know how to do, and something that Saint Teresa of Jesus lived, described with such precision that 4 centuries later, it is still intact, still waiting for the next soul who will read it with real attention. Picture the cell, the convent of the Incarnation in Avila, the year 1560. The wall is whitewashed stone. The bed is a straw pallet. The table is a wooden plank holding a dark wooden crucifix, an open book of hours, and a sheet of paper folded in half. The paper is stained with ink and bears several names written on it. Those names are the departed loved ones of Saint Teresa of Jesus. There is her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, who died in 1543 when she was 28 years old and had not yet lived through the definitive conversion that would launch her into founding the Discalced convents. There is her mother, Beatriz de Ahumada, who died when Saint Teresa was a girl of 14. There is her brother Rodrigo, who set sail for the Indies and died far from home. And there are 2 or 3 other sisters, some of them nuns themselves, gone before their time, according to the reckoning of that century, when the plague would empty entire cities from one month to the next. Those names leave the cell with her when she goes down to the choir at the hour of Eucharistic prayer. In the book of her life, chapter 22, where she describes what she calls the prayer of deep quiet before the sacrament, Saint Teresa of Jesus explains in her plain, direct prose what she used to do. She carried with her in her heart, not literally on the paper, when she entered the choir, the names of her departed loved ones. And she presented them to the Lord one by one when the consecrated host was exposed for the prolonged adoration that the Carmelite rule prescribed on certain marked days of the liturgical calendar. But she did not present them all at once in a single session. Here is the decisive detail that almost nobody emphasizes, and that is going to change the way you pray from now on. Saint Teresa of Jesus dedicated each hour of Eucharistic adoration to one single name, 1 hour for her father, another hour on another day for her mother, another hour again on a different day for her brother, and so on with each of her own in separate sessions, spaced out according to the liturgical calendar, and according to the urgencies she herself felt in her prayer. In The Way of Perfection, chapter 27, written between 1567 and 1569 for the sisters of her new foundation of Saint Joseph, she set down in her own words a sentence worth listening to slowly. When one single soul is presented to the Lord without being mixed in with other petitions, it receives from the sacrament a relief that souls bundled together in the plural almost never receive with the same fullness. That sentence sums up her Eucharistic practice for the departed. And it sums up, too, the fundamental error you have probably been making for years when you pray for your own. You offer up your father, your mother, your husband, your sister, the neighbor who died last year, all together in the same prayer session. You ask the Lord on behalf of all of them at once, as if it were enough to mention them in the same thought. And mixed prayer, according to the mind of Saint Teresa of Jesus, reaches the divine presence as a confused murmur of voices that need to be separated out before each one can be fully attended to. Christ, on the other hand, attends to one soul at a time. Each soul as if it were the only one. That is the key. Now here is a specific case. In the Accounts of Conscience, an autobiographical document Saint Teresa of Jesus dictated to her spiritual directors over various years of her maturity, there is recorded a decisive episode worth hearing in full, because it works as a mirror of what you can do in just a few days' time. A sister at the convent named Beatriz de Yepes had died of consumption in 1571 after a long agony that stretched out over months between physical pain and nights of high fever. Saint Teresa of Jesus, deeply grieved because she had known the departed sister since childhood and had watched her enter the novitiate as a young woman, decided to spend one full hour before the Blessed Sacrament exposed in the main chapel of the convent, with one single name present in her heart. The name was Beatriz, and nothing and no one else during those 60 minutes, not even her own parents, who were also among her usual list of departed. She says that she felt, near the end of the 60 minutes, an interior certainty, as clear as seeing an object in broad daylight. The soul of Beatriz had just entered into the full presence of God. The certainty was so firm that the saint wrote down, in her own words, "The Lord let me understand in that hour that Beatriz was already with him, and I knew without any fear of being mistaken that my prayer had been the last she needed." 60 minutes with one single name in the heart were enough for a soul to cross from purgatory to heaven, according to the written testimony of the saint herself. If the Carmelite saint wrote this down for her spiritual directors with that clarity, and if she said it in documents the Church has preserved for 4 centuries as part of the process of her canonization, the record stands as a concrete precedent for what you can do on Friday, June 12, 2026. You only have to apply the same formula she applied. One single name, one complete hour, one blessed sacrament exposed, and the interior certainty, proper to the Catholic faith, that the open heart of Christ, contemplated on the day universally consecrated to His glory, does not remain indifferent to the soul you are quietly offering up from a pew in the back row of your parish. That is the answer to the question left hanging from the beginning of this script. And it opens up still another more practical question, one that requires looking in detail at what you will be doing minute by minute through those 60 minutes when the church clock starts the count. 60 minutes seem like a lot when a person sits down alone before a tabernacle and starts to notice the small sounds of the church, the creaking of the wood in the pew, the motor of the baptistry refrigerator that suddenly clicks on, a woman who comes in to light a candle and walks back out, the bell tower clock striking the quarter hour. Your head fills up with things that did not come to that hour, but that come in anyway. What you need to pick up tomorrow, the call you still have to make, the comment your sister-in-law made last Sunday. That first difficulty was something Saint Teresa of Jesus knew better than anyone. In The Way of Perfection, chapter 29, She devotes entire pages to explaining how the mind is kept still when a devout woman sits down in silence before the tabernacle. And she leaves written an interior structure for extended prayer that has 4 successive movements, designed precisely for one complete hour of silent adoration, far removed from the brief format of ordinary visits to the tabernacle and from the rushed rosary said while the mind is somewhere else entirely. Those 4 movements are the backbone of your holy hour on June 12th. Let us go through them one by one. The first movement is called the handing over of the name. It happens in the first few minutes. You sit down or kneel before the Blessed Sacrament exposed. You take from your pocket the paper where you have written the name of the departed loved one for whom you are doing this. You open it calmly on the pew beside you. You read it once in interior silence without moving your lips. And you say to the Lord something very brief, in your own words. Something like, "Here I bring you this name, Lord, and I leave him in your open heart." That is the handing over, nothing more. You do not explain to God who he was, or how he died, or what virtues he had, or what debts he left behind. God already knows all of it. The handing over of the name is an act of pure faith. Here he is, I give him to you, make him yours. Saint Teresa of Jesus called this, in 16th century Castilian, placing another's soul into the hands of the spouse. The second movement is called the sustained silence, and it is where the overwhelming majority of those who attempt the holy hour fail, because after the handing over of the name, what follows is a long silence, 30, 40 minutes, during which you do nothing. You don't say formal prayers. You don't murmur devotions you have learned by heart. You don't actively think about the departed. You just stay there, looking at the sacrament, letting the time pass, feeling how the mind gets restless, gets tired, gets distracted, comes back, drifts off again, comes back once more. Saint Teresa of Jesus described this silence as the stillness that frightens the soul not yet used to it. She said that many of her sisters, when they were starting out in prolonged prayer, felt terror at their own silence during the first few months, because the silence gave back to them things of their own that they had spent years avoiding. But that silence is exactly where the heart of Christ does his work. In the interior castle, the 7th dwelling, chapter 2, she wrote words worth repeating slowly. When the soul falls silent, the spouse speaks to the other soul that is in purgatory. And that other soul hears what its intercessor no longer needs to say in words. That is to say, you fall silent so that Christ may speak to your departed loved one in your place. Your silence is the room he enters. The third movement is called the union of your own sorrow with the open heart. Around the 45th minute, when you start to feel the physical weariness of sitting still, there comes an interior movement that Saint Teresa of Jesus describes with precision. You have a sorrow, the specific sorrow of having lost that person, the sorrow of the things you did not tell him before he went, the sorrow of the things you did tell him that you would now take back if you could, the sorrow of the empty space he left at the table, in the bed, on the call log of the phone. That sorrow, in this third movement, you also hand over. You offer it up as an added gift to the suffrage, without asking anything for yourself in return. You say to the Lord, again in your own words, and very briefly, "This sorrow of mine I give you too. Join it to that of your wounded heart, and let it serve as part of the price." Saint Teresa of Jesus said it in the book of her life, chapter 30. The sorrow of the intercessor united to the heart of Christ redeems more than 1,000 rosaries said with the heart untouched. The fourth movement is the final handing over without taking back. It comes in the last 5 minutes of the hour. It is the most important of the 4 and the hardest one to practice well. It consists of something that seems simple and that almost nobody does completely, leaving the departed loved one there. Really leaving him, walking out of the church knowing that he is no longer yours, that he belongs to God. that you have handed him over, and that you are not going to take him back emotionally when you get home. Not tomorrow morning when you wake up with his memory. Not the next time you see his photograph on the dresser in the living room. Saint Teresa of Jesus called this the detachment of the intercessor. And she warned in serious tones that without this fourth movement, the other three lose much of their spiritual force, because the soul of the intercessor has stayed stuck to the departed and is not letting him finish the journey toward the definitive light of the Father. 4 successive movements, the 60 sustained minutes, and one single soul in purgatory. That interior structure of the holy hour, Saint Teresa of Jesus, left written in her canonical books 4 centuries before you read it here today in this script. And the decisive thing is that within that structure, something concrete happens that no ordinary devotional manual usually explains with enough clarity, because it belongs to the exact and precise moment when a soul crosses from purgatory to heaven. The moment when a soul crosses from purgatory to heaven is a theological point that the Church has taught for centuries with great care, because it belongs to the invisible order, and the mystics who have been granted permission to speak of it have always done so with sobriety. But the central doctrinal fact does exist, and it can be explained with precision. I am going to do that now, step by step, with no shortcuts. First fact. The Catholic Church, in the Manual of Indulgences published under John Paul II in 1999 and still in force in subsequent editions, grants a plenary indulgence to anyone who remains in Eucharistic adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, exposed in solemn form, for at least one continuous half hour. The concession is applicable, according to the terms of the manual itself, to one soul in purgatory on fulfillment of the usual conditions: sacramental confession within recent days, Eucharistic communion the same day, prayer for the intentions of the Roman Pontiff, and total detachment from all affection for sin, even venial sin. If you make one complete hour, you more than meet the half-hour minimum required, and you double the time recommended by the Church itself. Second fact. The plenary indulgence, according to the constant teaching of the Magisterium, reaffirmed by Paul VI in the Apostolic Constitution Indulgentiarum Doctrina of January 1, 1967, completely remits the temporal punishment due for sins already forgiven as to their guilt. Applied to a soul in purgatory, that remission acts as an immediate suffrage. What does that mean in plain language? It means that if a soul were in purgatory, undergoing, for example, the spiritual equivalent of 15 years of purification, and you correctly apply a plenary indulgence on its behalf on June 12th, that soul can be released into heaven at the very instant that the last requirement of the indulgenced act is fulfilled, with no further waiting. That is what the Church teaches. It is in the Catechism, paragraphs 1471 to 1479, and in any theological manual approved by the Holy See. Third fact, and this one is the most delicate to explain. You are not going to perceive the instant. That is the first warning. The vast majority of cases in which a soul crosses from purgatory to heaven, thanks to a suffrage applied by a living person, take place without any extraordinary phenomenon perceptible to the senses. The person who has made the prayer does not hear voices, does not see lights, does not feel supernatural chills or have visions. She just walks out of the church a little bit tired, a little bit moved, and goes home to make dinner. The soul crosses over all the same. And the reason you do not perceive anything is theological, not accidental. The Church has always taught that the suffrages of the living for the souls in purgatory operate in the order of faith, not in the order of the senses. If they were perceptible every time, faith would be unnecessary. That is why God usually leaves the effect in the invisible order, and only in very exceptional cases, like that of Saint Teresa of Jesus with Beatriz de Yepes, or that of Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque with several of her deceased spiritual directors, does he grant an interior certainty that can be verified. But here comes the second part, and it is decisive for you. your faith is enough. Your faith is exactly what sets the effect of the suffrage in motion. If you kneel down on June 12th before the Blessed Sacrament exposed, with the name of your departed loved one in your pocket and in your heart, and you stay there 1 full hour fulfilling the conditions of the indulgence, the soul for whom you have prayed receives the effect, whether your human senses perceive it or not. That is what the Church has taught since the Council of Trent, Session 25, the Decree on Purgatory, the year 1563. Saint Teresa of Jesus, who was living precisely in those years of Trent, said it in her own words in one of the letters preserved from her, addressed to her brother Lorenzo de Cepeda in 1577. The sentence is this, adapted from the Castilian of the time to your ear. Do not look your mercy for signs in prayer for the departed, for the Lord works beneath the veil and lifts it only when it pleases him. Beneath the veil, that is the image. The soul crosses over to heaven beneath the veil of faith. The veil stays in place throughout the entire hour. Your faith takes it for granted that behind the veil, God fulfills what he has promised his church. Fourth fact, and this last one closes the circle. There is a moment within your holy hour when the soul of your departed loved one, if God so disposes, does in fact cross over to heaven. That moment has no outward marker, but it has an interior marker that some mystics have described, and that you can also notice if you pay attention near the end of the 60 minutes. Saint Teresa of Jesus called it the relief of the intercessor. It is an intimate sensation of peace that comes suddenly toward the end of the hour, without your having sought it. An interior rest, as if the weight you were carrying had been lifted a little, as if the air weighed less when you breathed it in. That sensation by itself carries no binding doctrinal weight. The Church does not turn it into binding doctrine. But the mystics of Carmel have registered it for 4 centuries as one of the most frequent signs, always submitted to the serene discernment of faith. And even without that sign, the important work is done. The soul has crossed over, or the soul continues its journey with a major stretch of the road covered thanks to you. Only God knows how much and when. Your work ends the moment you walk out the church door and leave your departed loved one in the open heart of the spouse. And here comes one last common error worth closing off before June 12th catches you making it. What if you walk into the church on June 12th with the best intention in the world, take the paper out of your pocket, and it turns out you have written down 7 names: your father, your mother, your departed husband, your child who left before his time, 2 grandmothers, and that friend from the neighborhood who died last year and whom almost no one prays for anymore. 7 names, 1 single hour. What does Christ do with that? Saint Teresa of Jesus has a direct answer, and it is worth hearing all the way through because it corrects the most widespread error among devout Catholics who pray for their dead. Christ, she says, in The Way of Perfection, chapter 28, accepts the prayer made on behalf of many, but he divides it. He splits the grace that would have gone to one among the 7. And each one receives a 7th part of what he would have received if he had been the only one. That means, in practical terms for your holy hour on June 12th, that your father may not come out freed into heaven even if you put him on the list, because the force that would have been enough for him is divided up among the other 6. And none of them ends up receiving enough to cross over. Prayer on behalf of many is a natural part of the Christian heart. The Church recommends it in other contexts, especially in the daily prayer of a Christian, in the litanies for the departed, in the universal prayer of the funeral rite. But the holy hour, according to the precise teaching of Saint Teresa of Jesus, is something else. It is a prayer of total concentration. It is an arrow shot with all your strength at one single target. If the arrow is divided, no target falls. In the interior castle, the 6th dwelling, chapter 4, she put it in an image worth remembering. She said that the intercessory soul is like a spring. If the whole flow of the spring runs down one single channel, it waters the entire field. If the flow is divided up into 7 small ditches, Each ditch barely dampens the earth, and not one plant ends up really growing. Concentration, that is the Teresian word. And here comes a question that probably makes you uncomfortable. How do you choose among your own? How do you decide which of the 7 names goes on the paper for June 12? What happens to the other 6? Will your own heart forgive you for having given priority to your departed child and leaving your mother for another day, or the other way around? Is it right to choose? Saint Teresa of Jesus answered that question too, and the answer is probably different from what you might expect. She said, in a letter to a sister at the convent of Toledo dated 1579, that the choice should be made by the heart, without thinking it over too much, that the intercessory soul should ask the Lord in prior prayer which name should go on each specific holy hour, and that she should trust the first name that surges up with force inside her chest, because that one is usually the soul that most needs the deliverance at that particular moment. It is a spiritual choice, made from inside the chest without passing through the calculation of the mind. Sometimes it will be your father. Other times it will be your mother. Other times it will be that friend from the neighborhood whom almost nobody remembers anymore. God's criteria are usually different from yours. The Lord, said Saint Teresa of Jesus, attends first to the most forgotten souls, to those who have the fewest people praying for them, to those who have been the longest in the waiting room without any news reaching them from earth. Those souls Christ wants first, and sometimes He puts them into your heart without your understanding why. It takes spiritual courage to accept that logic, because the human mind, especially the mind of a mother or a daughter, prefers to pray first for those whom the blood calls out for the loudest, for the father, for the husband, for the son. And the Church absolutely respects that affective priority in daily prayer. But in the holy hour, the criterion sharpens. Christ invites you into an act of universal charity that places the spiritual family ahead even of the family of blood. And here comes the nuance that the great majority of the devout pass right over. If God puts on your heart the name of a person outside your family on June 12th, and you agree to present that person to Christ during that hour, something extra happens. Your own departed loved one, the one of your blood, the one you have spent years wanting to free, receives an indirect benefit through the charity you have just practiced on behalf of someone else. The communion of saints works that way within the supernatural economy. When you free the soul of the friend from the neighborhood whom almost no one remembered on earth anymore, that soul, now in heaven, immediately intercedes for your own from the other side of the veil. And the intercession of a soul already glorified before the Father exceeds in effectiveness, according to the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica, 3rd part, question 89, any prayer made from earth by a Christian still on the road. Your act of universal charity on June 12th becomes, in this way, a double suffrage. One direct, for the name on your paper, one indirect, multiplied by the heavenly intercession, for the names you left off the paper, but that the Lord knows you carry in your heart. That is why what Saint Teresa of Jesus asked of her sisters, what Christ had already said to Margaret Mary, and what stands in Catholic doctrine all come together. One single name, one complete hour, and complete trust that the economy of the mystical body does the rest. All that is left now is the most concrete thing of all. How to do all this in practice on June 12th. Start the night before, Thursday night, June 11th. Before you go to bed, find a small piece of paper, white if possible, and write on it the name you have chosen. Just the first name. No last name if that feels easier. No date of death. No place of burial. The shield name. The one that rises up in your chest when you think of that person and you hear his voice inside your head. Fold the paper in half. Tuck it into your wallet, into the inside pocket of the jacket you plan to wear, or into the purse you are going to take with you the next day. The paper sleeps with you. Friday, June 12th, begins in the morning. First thing, attend the Mass of the Solemnity of the Sacred Heart. In Spain and Latin America, most parishes celebrate it at 9, at 10, at 11, or in the evening at 7. Pick the one that fits your day. Receive Holy Communion in a state of grace. Go to confession beforehand if you have not been within the last 20 days. Pray for the intentions of the Roman Pontiff. One Our Father and one Hail Mary, said with that intention, is enough. And make an interior act of detachment from all affection for sin, even venial sin. With that, you have fulfilled the conditions for the plenary indulgence of the day. That is half of the doctrinal work already done. The other half you will do in the holy hour. Now comes the practical question. Where do you make a holy hour before the Blessed Sacrament exposed on a weekday Friday? 3 realistic options, ordered by how easy they are to reach. The first, chapels of perpetual Eucharistic adoration. In any mid-sized city in Spain, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Peru, the Hispanic United States, and other Catholic countries, there are chapels where the Blessed Sacrament is permanently exposed 24 hours a day. Look online with the words Perpetual Adoration and the name of your city. You will find the hours and the exact address. Chapels of Perpetual Adoration are open to any of the faithful, with no need for prior registration. Get there half an hour before the time you plan to start, so you can settle in without rushing. The second, parishes that organize a specific holy hour on the Friday of the Sacred Heart. Call your parish this very week and ask whether June 12th they have prolonged Eucharistic exposition, either in the morning before Mass or in the evening after Vespers. In many Spanish-speaking parishes, this practice is kept alive, especially in parishes run by the Jesuits, the Claretians, or by Sacred Heart confraternities. The third, if the first 2 options fall through, speak directly to your parish priest. Ask him whether on Friday, June 12th, he might expose the Blessed Sacrament for 1 hour at the parish, specifically for the faithful who want to make a holy hour on the Solemnity of the Sacred Heart. Most priests will agree if you ask in good time and with a reasonable purpose, and many end up thanking you for the suggestion. Once you are in the church, arrive 5 minutes before the start time. Sit close, but not in the front row, unless you feel very much at home up there, in which case, go right ahead. The second to last row works particularly well because it lets you see the Blessed Sacrament exposed without being distracted by the movements of other people. Take the folded paper out and leave it open on your lap or on the pew in front of you, where your eye can come back to it now and again without effort. Switch your phone all the way off, not on silent, but completely off, so that no vibration or light interrupts the presence. Take 2 or 3 deep breaths, look at the consecrated host in the monstrance, and begin. The 4 movements you saw earlier in the script fall into place on their own if you have come prepared. First, the handing over of the name, then the long silence. Around the 45th minute, the union of your sorrow with the open heart. In the last 5 minutes, the final handing over without taking back. And when it is over, when the clock marks the complete hour, get up slowly, make a deep genuflection to the Blessed Sacrament exposed, fold the paper back up with the name on it, and put it in your pocket. Walk out of the church without rushing. Do not speak to anyone for the first few minutes on the way home. Let the silence of the hour keep working in you throughout the rest of the day. That night before you sleep, burn the paper. Burn it in an ashtray or in a small earthenware bowl. Watch the letters of the name catch and burn. And understand, with the sobriety of the Catholic faith, that the name has just been handed over in one complete hour to the open heart of Christ on the universal solemnity of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, with a plenary indulgence applied according to what the Church herself has established, and according to the teaching that Saint Teresa of Jesus left written 4 centuries ago for souls like yours. What happens after that hour belongs to God. But there is one last sentence from Saint Teresa of Jesus that deserves to be quoted as a doctrinal closing to everything you have heard. It is in the Book of her Foundations, chapter 5, written in 1573 during the visits she made to her new convents. The sentence is this, adapted from the Castilian of the time to your ear. When a Christian soul hands over one complete hour of Eucharistic prayer for another Christian soul who has died, the Lord looks upon that hour as if it were molten gold, and He uses it where He knows it best serves, without asking us for an accounting of the timing. Molten gold, that is the image Saint Teresa of Jesus used. Your hour on June 12th is transformed into molten gold in the hands of the Lord, and He applies it where it most serves, on the schedule that only He knows, for the soul that only He knows has been waiting precisely for that gold for a long time now. Your work ends there, where His begins, and now you know what the great majority of Catholics walk past their whole lives without ever discovering. One exact hour, one precise date in the universal calendar of the Church, one name written alone on a small piece of paper, one blessed sacrament exposed on the altar, and one heart opened on the cross that the Church consecrates on June 12, 2026 with all the force of her tradition, from St. Margaret Mary Alacoque to Saint Teresa of Jesus, by way of Leo XIII, Pius XIII, the Catechism, and the Manual of Indulgences now in force. You have received the doctrine, and you have received the practice as well. You know what a plenary indulgence applied on behalf of a departed loved one is. You know what happens inside your 60 minutes when you hand over one single name to the exposed sacrament. You know why concentration weighs more than quantity, and why an arrow divided up never lands on any target. You know what the relief of the intercessor consists of, that sudden interior peace that the mystics of Carmel recorded for 4 centuries without ever turning it into a requirement. You will carry a folded paper in your pocket starting Thursday, June 11th. You will carry a name written in small letters. You will carry the certainty, proper to the Catholic faith, that the Lord looks on your hour of June 12th as if it were molten gold. And above all, you will carry the peace of knowing that the soul you loved so much, the one you have been asking for under your breath all these years every time you looked at his empty place at the table, is now being attended to by the entire mystical body with the force of the universal liturgy of the Church. The holy hour of June 12th is only the door of entry, a very important door, yes, a door that the majority of devout Catholics will never cross. But behind it opens up an entire lifetime of Eucharistic prayer for your departed loved ones that the Church has guarded century after century in the teaching of her mystics, and that Saint Teresa of Jesus described with such detail that her books still open in Carmelite cells 4 centuries later. There are other marked hours on the Catholic calendar worth learning, ones that connect directly with this one of June 12th. There are specific days of the liturgical year on which the souls in Purgatory receive graces that do not reach with the same force during the rest of the year. There are sacred objects placed in the home with a specific purpose, to accompany the prayer for the departed over months at a time. And there are words spoken in a low voice before the tabernacle that act like balm on the open wound of separation that you have been carrying inside ever since the day he went. Saint Teresa of Jesus left all of that in writing, in the pages of the book of her life that few readers walk through all the way to the end, in the chapters of the Way of Perfection, where she speaks to her sisters as if she was speaking to you directly from the other side of time, in the corners of the interior castle, where the 7th dwelling opens like a window onto heaven, and in the letters she wrote from the convents she was founding across Castile, with the sober steadiness of a mystical woman who knew that faith reaches deeper than her own interior experience. What is coming up right now is exactly the next piece of the puzzle that your heart was asking for. without knowing it. One more specific revelation from Saint Teresa of Jesus that links up with the holy hour you have just understood, and that completes it in a way very few Catholics have ever seen the two pieces joined. If you have made it this far, listening with real attention, what comes next closes the circle in a different way than you might expect. It opens it, rather. It opens it toward another dimension that on Friday, June 12th, you will no longer be able to separate from your holy hour because the two pieces work joined together. Stay right where you are. The voice that has accompanied you up to this point is going to continue with you with another concrete teaching about your departed loved ones, about your home, about the exact place in the mystical body where you belong and where they have been waiting for you for some time now. A teaching that the majority of devout Catholics have never heard, with this doctrinal depth anchored in 4 centuries of unbroken Carmelite tradition. What is coming has been made with souls who share your same sorrow in their hearts and the same date marked on their calendars. Let that second teaching reach you now, without changing windows or looking away just yet, because the force of what you have just learned loses quality if it is not completed by what comes in the next few minutes. And before that second voice begins, let me say my goodbye right here, without ceremony, like a friend who walks you to the door and lingers a moment more on the landing, watching you before closing it behind her. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote one small sentence in the margin of one of her personal notebooks, not often quoted by her commentators, that reads like this, translated from the Castilian of the 16th century into yours. The soul that prays for her dead walks a road that ends in her own home on the day when she herself is dead and another living soul prays for her. That is exactly what you are doing right now. You are opening, with your holy hour on June 12th, the road that one day another living soul will walk on behalf of you. May the Lord of the living and of the dead bless you with the immense peace that only the open heart of Christ is capable of giving you. And may June 12th find you on your knees with a name in your pocket, looking at the exposed sacrament.